Hello class, welcome to this lecture on media and critical thinking. Today we're going to talk about news media and news outlets and how they work, and we're also going to talk about the sticky subject of fake news and how to detect it and be better consumers of media in general. So let's get to it. Let's start with a little quiz. What do you think more people die from each year? Lightning bolts or tornadoes? Those of us from Kansas can relate. Diabetes or homicides? Which one do you think we're more likely to die of? And lastly, change of question. Who do you think is more likely to recidivate or commit the same crime again? A registered sex offender or a non-registered sex offender? The answers to these questions will come at the end of the presentation. And the point of these questions is to show you something called the media paradox. And the media paradox goes something like this. The more we rely on popular media to inform us, the more apt we are to misplace our fears. Basically, the media do a great thing for us, news media do. They inform us of what's going on in the world. However, the fact that media have to be given in a certain format, especially the news, where maybe you only have a half hour to inform the world of what's going on, that there are certain decisions that media news producers have to make the best of their 30 minutes or 60 minutes of the time that they get of airing news to people. And unfortunately, no matter how you cut the cookie or whatever news outlet you listen to or work for, there are some inherent things that news media are going to have, and we'll call them inherent issues, that are just not avoidable because of the format in which news is given. And we're going to talk about two of these issues. The first issue is newsworthiness. The idea here is, because you only have 30 minutes or a page of writing or 600 words or an hour, it's not possible for a news outlet to report every single little thing that's going on in the world. So what news outlets have to do is they have to decide what is considered newsworthy, okay? Now, newsworthiness is basically, this is something, it's an idea that a particular article or a particular issue is worth listening to at this time. Now, depending on the journalist and the school of journalism that you go to, people define newsworthiness differently. But this can give you an example of what we might consider to be newsworthy, that it's timely. It's something that's happening right now versus something that happened 2 years ago or something that's going to happen in the future. Proximity has to deal with, is the event close to us? Because see, if the event is far away, people may not be as interested, but if the event's like next door or is happening across the street from me, I'm going to be more interested in listening to this news article. Possible future impact. Does the news article or does this piece have some kind of impact on my future and how I make future decisions? If it does, it's going to make it more of a hot news item that's going to be more interesting to us. Shock value. Does it emit some kind of emotion out of people? Because if you bring out a news piece and it's timely, it's happening right now and it's happening to you and here right across the street, and it's going to impact how you go to work every day, and it's going to shock you because it's a really angry thing that's going to happen, that's going to get interest. Prominence just has to do if it involves big names or big people who are interesting to us or themes that are interesting to us. And then human interest is, does the piece somehow have implications for the human condition as a whole? Because ultimately, news is about humanity and what is humanity doing to itself, good or bad. Now, because news media outlets are generally for profit, they're going to have to make decisions for their market. So if a news outlet knows that most of its readers or most of its viewers are a younger audience, They're going to try to define newsworthiness in terms of what would interest a younger audience in this case. Okay? If a news outlet knows that it has a right-wing readership base, then what's newsworthy is going to have that slant to it. Same thing if it was a left-wing or a centrist or whatever, or libertarian. So newsworthiness is really a big deal in terms of what news is reported. So that's why if you go to the gym, for example, or if you go to any other place that has multiple TVs side by side, if you look at like Fox News, what they're reporting versus like what CNN's reporting, and you see them side by side, they report very different stuff because of this issue of newsworthiness and the fact that they have different markets. Now, another issue with newsworthiness then is news is going to report things that are not typical, right? What we mean is that if a plane takes off from Los Angeles and lands successfully in Kansas, that's probably not going to be all that interesting, even though that's the commonplace thing that occurs, okay? But if a plane takes off in Los Angeles and it crashes on the way to Kansas, that's going to make the news because that is newsworthy, right? It's timely, it has shock value, it has human interest, it's safety, it has possible future impact because now I'm going to be possibly on planes that might crash. Even though plane crashes are relatively rare, that's what's going to get reported because that's what gets newsworthy. So newsworthiness, in a way, tells us about things that are not common more times than they tell us things that are common. The second feature of news is vividness. And what we mean is, once it's been decided that a certain issue or a certain story is newsworthy and that it's going to get human interest and it's going to have some sort of shock value or proximity or any of those other conditions that we talked about of newsworthiness, or it's going to speak to their market, because remember, news media is money driven. The other issue they're going to have to face is they have to somehow make the story vivid. And what we mean is that they're going to have to take something that's abstract and make it really speak to us. Because they could just have, a professor like me just read a bunch of statistics, but that's not interesting for a half-hour segment, right? And you're trying to listen to the news while you're cooking or you're around the TV and it's family time and you're watching TV. That's just not interesting to people. People want stories. People want pictures. People want, video of this and somebody talking, and, they want cool headlines and colors and all that stuff. So part of what a news article is going to do is it's going to try to bring the story home to you. And they're going to have experts and people talk and, crying and all those things, because that's what makes the story interesting. And that makes people want to watch. But unfortunately, because they present things so vividly so that we will watch them, sometimes we get sort of an exaggerated understanding of what the situation really is, or the situation can get blown out of proportion because of how vivid it's made, okay? So you can see, just by the format in which news has to be presented to us to be competitive and to be interesting, they have to present things that are newsworthy, which can often not be the norm, things that are outside of the norm. And number two, it has to present it in a way that's going to be interesting to us, which can mean that it can sort of blow things out of proportion at times, okay? Because it's so vivid, it's more impactful than it needs to be. So hence the media paradox. The more we rely on popular media to inform us, the more apt we are to misplace our fears. You can see how these two features of news, while good intention, also have unintended consequences. Now, that was just a short little bib on news in terms of like news outlets. The more popular kind of news that we're getting now is through social media. And you can see here by the Pew Research study done in May 2016, about 6 in 10 Americans get their news from social media. And you can see that 18% say often, 26% say sometimes, and 18% say hardly ever. So, I mean, if you don't count the hardly ever, then it goes down to 44%. But still, that's quite a bit, right? That's roughly half the American population that we get our news from social media platforms. In that same study by the Pew Research Center, most social news consumers only get news on one site. So 64% of the people who get their news from social media, most of them just go to one site. Some will go get two, so you have the 26% here that go to two, and then only 10% get their news from three or more sites. So it's easy to imagine that a lot of people perhaps go on Facebook or Reddit or Twitter. And in fact, we have the study here that shows, it's still the Pew Research Center, but you see here the different social media outlets that people draw from. So 67% of US adults who use Facebook get their news from this site, and we can probably recall from last year's election that this was big in terms of the peddling of fake news. Then you see YouTube is on here, but Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, Reddit, you can see that all of these social media outlets are very important when it comes to people getting news. So it may not be your Fox, CBS, NBC, and so forth. It's whatever news gets shared on these social media websites. So because so much media, and especially news media, gets shared on social media platforms, news media is a lot more decentralized now. And there's all kinds of different sites now that you can provide news or purportedly provide news. And in this rise in decentralization of media from the mainstream outlets, we now have the rise of something called fake news, okay? Because not all of these outlets legitimately produce news, okay, or do it in a legitimate way. And one of the sources that you have on the Baker Moodle is a list of fake news websites. Now, the curator of that list was actually somebody I went to graduate school with, so I know this person personally. We actually had some classes together. And originally, the list that she compiled was just for her own media literacy class, but people started sharing it and it became this big thing. And now she got interest from other nonprofits and organizations, and now it's kind of become this official list where she systematically went through a list of over 2,000 sites and classified them accordingly based on some standards that you'll see once you look at the resource. Now, the interesting and kind of the sad thing about this is when she made this, she just meant it to be something for her class and as a starting point for discussion about fake news, and it became this big thing. But she's gotten death threats from people for making this list, and it's just kind of sad because it's like, if you don't like the argument, attack the argument, don't attack the person. So hopefully you'll look through that list and you'll use it. But what we want to talk about here in this lecture is about fake news and its role and how we can stop ourselves from using this and sharing it and disseminating it. So there are actually two different definitions of fake news, and I don't know if people realize this when they say that news is fake. The first definition of fake news, and this is probably what people may mean, and maybe this is what you think when you think of fake news, is news that's not based on a factual event. In other words, the news is a fabrication. In this case, it would be something like a news article that just has no basis in fact. Like it never happened, it's just this thing that somebody made up. It's essentially fiction, right? Somebody just made it up entirely. So when somebody says that article isn't true, it's fake news, then what they might be saying is it's a fabrication. Okay, so this is an issue of the news being a fabrication. It's fiction, it's false, anything like that ever happened. Whoever wrote it was just completely off their rocker, no basis in reality at all. And the issue here is just an issue of verification, right? So the way to prove that news isn't fake is just to provide the evidence to say that never happened, right? And so it's an issue of just verifying that no, whatever this story said just isn't true. Here are the facts, and you can see for yourself, I was not on that plane, or I was not doing that thing, or I never said that thing. Here's the recording. No words were ever said about that. Okay, so that's one definition of fake news. But another definition of fake news, and maybe this is what some people are really trying to get at, is that it's news that's based on a factual event, but is presented as a bigger deal than what it is. So in this case, it might be true that somebody said something but the people in the news are sensationalizing it way too much, or making it to be a bigger deal than what it actually is. In this case, it's not a question of fact or fiction. It's just a question, and it's more of an opinion essentially, whether this is a big deal or not such a big deal. So in this case, in definition number one, fact versus false, right? Fact or fiction here. Here, it's just like, in your opinion, is that a big deal or not? Well, to me, it's not a big deal, so it's fake news. They're just trying to make something out of nothing. But maybe for somebody else, oh no, this is a big deal. The fact that our president said this or did that to this person, that's a big deal to me because I don't think presidents should do that. Okay, so to you, that is not fake news, that's real news. So one is about fact, one is about opinion, okay? So we have to be clear about when we say something is fake news. Now, as we go a little bit deeper into this, we're going to kind of look at both definitions here as they apply. But just know that when somebody says that, you kind of have to ask for clarification because these are two very separate issues in terms of fake news. What we first want to do is look at different types of fake news. One type is called clickbait, and this is where they basically use very sensational or biased headlines to lure traffic and to get you to click on their article, okay? Now, these can look like this example here. You'll never believe which two stars got into a fight on the red carpet last night. Click to find out which starlet they were fighting over. So you notice that like the article isn't very descriptive at all about or the title isn't very descriptive at all about what the article's about. But the point is just to get you to click on this little link here, and then you find out it's not really that big of a deal, or you do, and it's like, okay, well, who cares? That kind of thing. So in responsible journalism, this should never be a headline, okay? So if people were taking journalism classes at the university that I taught prior, this would fail, okay? This would fail, this would not pass a journalism class because a headline is supposed to give you a brief summary of what the article's about so then the reader is interested in actually reading it, okay? So if the news sites that you're going to kind of have these very sensational headlines that are clearly biased, you couldn't believe the evil that, Barack Obama said about this evil, person, blah, blah, blah. If there's judgmental words in it, if there's very, very biased language in the headlines, that's a huge red flag that you're probably dealing with fake news here. But the thing is, fake news can be based on fabricated news, or it can also be distorted. So there could be some truth value to the articles, but either they're very distorted, or they're presented in such a way you're not really getting the facts. You're just getting somebody's opinion mixed with a fact, with maybe a small little fact. So you have to be very careful with clickbaity titles like these. Another type of fake news site is conspiracy and hoax sites. And these are sites that are known to promote conspiracy theories and hoaxes. Now, we haven't talked about conspiracy theories next. This lecture I was going to, but then too much. I don't want this lecture to run too long, so probably the next lecture we'll learn about conspiracy theories. And the problem is that a lot of conspiracy and hoax sites, junk science sites, all of those, they have their site that's dedicated to promoting whatever conspiracy or hoax they want to promote. But then they usually have news, like a news page, where they take news articles and they either write them or they share other fake news articles, and it's to promote the general conspiracy that they're promoting, okay? So you have to be careful of those when you look at a news website. Is there a general conspiracy that they're trying to promote in the first place? Then you can understand that the news that they're going to select is going to be very selected on that. And I should add that it can even be wider than a conspiracy or a hoax website. I would even argue that websites that are based on a general interest. So like a religious website that has a news page might selectively produce news or selectively pick news that supports its agenda of promoting whatever religion, or a gun enthusiast site, or a pro-marijuana site, and so forth. So you have to think about is there some specific agenda that the website is promoting clearly, and the implications of how it presents and writes news. Then we have satire sites. Now, sometimes it's very clear when a site is purposefully fake news, but that's the point. They are fake news, and it's for satire purposes, right? So The Onion is a very good example of this. The Onion presents fake news, but you kind of know because it's The Onion that it's fake because it's so funny, right? They make it very funny, and of course it's not realistic. Now, you might have seen this, especially maybe last election season, but maybe somebody posted an Onion article and one of your friends on Facebook didn't know what The Onion was, so they thought it was a real news story, and then they started going off. It's kind of funny, right, to see that. But there's other humor in satire websites that aren't The Onion that people don't know about, that people might mistake for real news. So in that list, you'll find some other satire sites that are lesser known, but have been shared and forwarded, and some people have taken it as real news. So if the article seems to try to be funny, or if you see kind of irony in it, or it looks like it's exaggerated in some way, you might want to ask, is this a satire website? Okay, if it's just too funny or too good to be true, it might be satire. And then lastly, the one I want to talk about is altered images. Now, this has become more of a thing now, where people take images and then doctor them to misrepresent visual reality. There's a site that shows a lot of pictures from Hurricane Sandy. In fact, this is one of them right here, where somebody said that, look, this is the hurricane from Hurricane Sandy. You know, here's the Statue of Liberty. Turns out that that photo was taken from the Day After Tomorrow movie, a not very good movie, by the way. But there's all kinds of photos like that that have been shared about Superstorm Sandy, where they basically took a photo that was made at another time and then just made it look like, or contextualize it as, this was taken during Superstorm Sandy. On the website, it showed like some that were taken in 2008 or 2007 and then just rehashed to be, this is Superstorm Sandy aftermath. So we have to be very skeptical about images nowadays because it's just too easy to doctor them, to Photoshop them. And of course, you always have to wonder, why would somebody go out of their way to make fake images? And it's just kind of like, I don't know, why would some people go out and make fake news? It's just, I don't know. So you have to be aware of these kinds of things and don't believe every picture that you see. Now, there are other types of fake news out there, and we can go in depth a lot more, but I think just talking about these really quick is good enough. You have rumor mills. So a lot of celebrity gossip websites, Natalie Portman fell to her death in New Zealand, obviously was not true. It's a fabrication, but Global Associated News is a rumor mill. State news outlets are basically news outlets that are controlled by the government. So if you go to North Korean news or, Russian state news, obviously the government controls the news outlets there. There's no First Amendment rights in those places. So of course you have to be very skeptical when it's coming from a propagandist government. There's junk science news websites, so news that use pseudoscience, so from the previous Science and Critical Thinking lecture what those might look like. Be careful of those. There's also hate news websites, so news websites that are dedicated to promoting hate or discrimination against a certain group of people. So you have to be aware of those as well. Does the news outlet have some kind of political agenda that they're clearly promoting? Then you have to be at least a little bit cautious about the news that they're reporting. Now, let's talk about 10 ways to detect fake news. And this is very important stuff for helping you in your future of digesting and using news, okay? Just like how we take nutrition classes and learn what food is good for us and what food is junk food, we have to do the same thing with with our news intake. Our nutritional intake is just like our food intake. So one of the first things you can do whenever you look at a news site is check the About and About Me pages. Is it written by somebody who's credible, okay? Are the authors' names even posted? And when you click on the author's name, does it go through their credentials? Does it say, here's this author's background on speaking on this subject, okay? If there's no author credentials or if there's no author at all, you're going to have to be a little bit suspicious because then who knows who wrote that article, okay? And there's no accountability for the person who wrote it. Secondly, inspect the URLs. So there are some clear indicators when a news site is probably fake, okay? If it has a .co, so if you have like .co or you also have the .lo domains, usually those are a bit suspect. If it's a .edu, That's a little, that's obviously going to be better because we know that's an educational institution. Com can go either way because .com is .commercial. So look at the URLs. Is it an official site or is it somebody's blog? Is it this long list? Is it this long hyperlink from this obscure website? That might be a good indicator right there as well. And you have to look at, it's not going to be like one thing's going to determine it. You got to look at all of these signs as a whole and make an overall judgment. Next, you got to suspect the sensational, okay? So the more sensational the headline is written, the more angry or upsetting or emotional that the article is written, the more you have to be suspected or suspicious of the article, okay? If it's exaggerated, if it's provocative, if there's excessive use of capital letters, that should all raise red flags because journalists do not learn how to write that way in journalism school. Investigate the primary sources. Remember the scientific studies little lecture from John Oliver that I posted the previous week? So when a news article says a recent study showed that eating chocolate solves heart disease, check to see what that study actually says. Nowadays, news articles will provide you the link to the study. So click on the link and see if the study actually says that. You'll often find that what the news article is saying, what the study says, is not exactly what the study says, okay? And the only way to know is to go to the primary sources. If you do not learn anything else in this class, number 4, go to the primary sources. Number 5 is check back on the story at a later time. So if there's a story and, sometimes stories develop over time. And, you'll find that when you read a story once and you come back to it a couple hours later, there are some modifications to the story or some things were, continuing to be added to the story, okay? And as you come back to the story, it might grow into a fuller picture. So it might sound like right now this and this is happening, but when you come back a couple hours later, you'll find, oh, but this just in, what was happening wasn't a big deal, it was actually this, okay? So come back to the story at a later time. The next 5, for some reason my numbering got thrown off. So number 6 is check your biases, okay? So just because a news article says something that conveniences you, okay, or sounds good or supports your political beliefs or assumptions about a person or event or an idea, doesn't suddenly make it true news, just as if it goes against what you believe, it makes it fake news. So you have to check your biases and make sure, am I enjoying this article or am I believing this article because it agrees with me? Or am I believing this article because there actually is credibility to this article? So you have to separate yourself from your biases and the way the article is actually presented. Those two things do not necessarily go together. Next, you have triangulate, okay? Triangulation is important. Triangulation means going to a third source. Don't get all of your news articles from one source. If you see this interesting article that's just wow, this is amazing, I can't believe this is happening, I would immediately start looking for other news outlets reporting on this article and see if they're providing the same thing. If there's only one news outlet reporting it and it's this big deal, trust me, other news outlets will eventually pick up on it. But if they aren't, it's probably not true. Consider your genre is another one. So you also have to ask yourself as you're reading this article, is this really a news article or is this an opinion piece and somebody's just commenting on the news? Okay? How much of this is just straight facts of what's going on and how much of this is pure commentary? Sometimes people read an opinion article and think it's a news article when in fact it's more of an opinion. Another thing you have to think about is, was it shared? If the article came from somebody sharing something on social media, you might have to wonder, why is this being shared rather than just being posted on a regular website and so forth, okay? So consider where you're getting your articles from and seeing if actually this is an article intended to get clicks or if this is an article that's really having some interest in getting putting out the truth of whatever is going on. And then lastly, check suspicious images. So if there's we have photographic evidence of, this person doing this or Mark doing that. One thing you can do to see whether that image is actually real or that image actually is not from another thing, from another time, from another context, you can do a Google reverse image search where you drag and drop the image in the Google Images search box, and it'll tell you other places where this image appears. And if it turns out that the image appears on somebody's photography portfolio website from 3 years ago, and now it's being used as a photograph of somebody doing something today, you know that the image is fake, right? And the person photoshopped it and made it, what it is. So you have to do that work, though, to figure out if that's the case. Now, that can sound like a lot of work, and, you can't just passively consume news like it's entertainment. But the best thing I think you can do, if you don't want to have to do all that work, is simply to diversify your outlets. Don't get all your news from one source. If there's one thing I would say about news media is diversify. Just like how you diversify your nutritional intake, you don't eat the same thing every day, you eat diverse things. You shouldn't get your news from the same place every day. You should go from diverse sources. Go to the left-leaning news articles, websites, and then go to the right-leaning ones and see their perspective. Go to the centrist ones. Draw from multiple places with different orientations and get a balanced view of what's going on, okay? And the more balanced your view is, the more educated you sound. The less balanced view you have, the more political and zealotry, the more zealot, what's the adjective for zealotry? I don't know, zealous that you sound, okay? So, think about getting a balanced view, which means getting both sides rather than just one side. And in conclusion, even trustworthy news outlets make mistakes. So this is not necessarily a defense of all news outlets, and news outlets are perfect, and there's not bias and those kinds of things. But a trustworthy news outlet will still make mistakes at times because people are human. But the difference is between a trustworthy news outlet and an untrustworthy one is that trustworthy news outlets correct their mistakes. So they'll retract a story, they will fire journalists, they will put journalists on leave, they will do whatever they need to do to correct the error. A bad news site or a bad news outlet will just put out a bad story and never say anything about it and never retract it and just leave it there. So just because an outlet retracts a story, in some ways that's a sign of a good news outlet, not necessarily a bad one, okay? It's better that they correct it than to leave it uncorrected. But number 2 is, just because the news is dissonant with your beliefs does not mean that it's fake. So yes, things happen in the world that may run against your personal or political beliefs. A candidate that you really, really like does something that you really, really hate. But just because you don't like what the candidate did or you don't like the implications of the news story doesn't necessarily mean it's fake. It can still be true. So you have to separate what you wish would be the case and what actually is the case. And don't try to discredit or say that an article is false just because you don't like what it says. You have to separate the two, what's materially true versus what's materially pleasant, okay? And lastly, learn how your news is made just like how your food is made. Remember, I kind of talked about how our news intake is just like our nutritional intake, and we have to diversify. Well, just like how we get very skeptical about our ingredients, and we're all about, gluten-free, whatever-free, wheat-free, whatever. The news is the same way. Learn about the outlets that you get your news from. How do they make their news? Who makes it? How are they presenting it? And be skeptical and be picky about where you get your news from, as long as it's based on good standards. So to end, here's what you should be afraid of. You should be afraid of lightning, number 1. More people die from lightning than they do from tornadoes. So those of you in Kansas, be afraid. Number 2, diabetes kills more people, 100 times more people than homicides. Homicide stories are interesting, don't get me wrong. I'm sure people there's all kinds of homicide shows on TV, and news stories about homicides are interesting. But diabetes, you're more likely to die from that than from homicide. So watch what you eat. And actually, when it comes to recidivism, the non-sex offenders are more likely to commit their crimes again than sex offenders. So you always hear an article about, a sex offender got left out of prison and then they committed an act again, and see, we can't let sex offenders out of prison. Those are much more rare compared to the burglar who gets let out of prison and commits a burglary the next day, or the murderer who gets out of prison and commits the murder the next day. So be afraid of burglars and murderers coming out of prison. And with that, That's media and critical thinking, and that's what you should be afraid of.